Hey everybody, what is going on? Hexlex here, got another Master Duel video for you. It is time yet again for another one of our monthly tier lists. At the end/beginning of the season, I like to recap what the current meta looks like on a tier list, going from tiers 1, 2, 3, and Rogue. It's always a fun time. I love making these videos. Tomorrow's video is also going to be a very fun time. For those who do not know, tomorrow we are announcing the winners of the first ever Plex Leaderboard Challenge. More details about that can be found in the description below, and if you were interested in playing this month and are a bit dismayed that we are announcing the winners, don't worry, because we're doing the Plex Leaderboard Challenge again this next month, and we'll be doing it weekly. We'll be handing out prizing weekly instead of at the end of the month like we did for this season. So more details to come in tomorrow's video about that, but let's go ahead and start putting these decks on the tier list. Before I do, though, I gotta give a super quick disclaimer. The tier list videos are definitely very divisive sometimes, which, you know, as far as that goes in the comments section, I think that discourse is really fun, but rudeness is not. So if you disagree with my tier placements, and you want to vocalize that in the comments, that's 100% fine. Totally encourage that, as long as you're not being a jerk about it. That's the only thing that I do ask. Also, every single tier list video, every single one, I'll get multiple comments being like, where's this deck I like? Where's my favorite deck? So as far as the decks that I've selected here, I've got 30, and these are the 30 most used decks according to Untapped from Platinum to Master Rank. That's what determined what I put here. If your favorite deck is not here, that doesn't mean it's bad, that doesn't mean it's not Rogue, or maybe even one of the above tiers. Although I think I covered pretty much everything that fits in tiers 1 through 3 here, but you know, I see a lot of people say like, oh, you don't have my favorite deck, well, you must think it's horrible then. It's like, no, not even close. There are so many decks that I put in the Rogue category, which I do also want to give a bit of a disclaimer about the Rogue category here. I also get comments pretty regularly that assume that if I'm putting a deck in this category, I think it's bad. Couldn't be further from the truth. If a deck goes in the Rogue category, that means that while not as good as tier 3, 2, or 1 decks, it is still more than capable of reaching Master 1 or seeking in a tournament top with a dedicated pilot. So yeah, that's all my disclaimers about the tier list here. So now that we've gotten all that out of the way, let's start putting decks on here. I'm just going to start from the top right here with Dinomorphia. Dinomorphia got a piece of support relatively recently, but even beyond that, it's just always been a pretty good deck, honestly. I think it's always kind of bounced around between tier 3 and Rogue, and in that kind of vein, I think I'm going to use Dinomorphia as one of my kind of like, what's the word I'm looking for? Borderline decks, where there are some decks where I really think you could make a solid argument for them being either, like, you know, in the tier I put them in or the tier above/below. For Dinomorphia, I think you can make an argument that they're like one of the best Rogue decks or one of the lowest tier 3 decks. I am going to put them at the bottom of tier 3. I think that's a good spot for them. Of course, I might change my mind over the course of the video, but yeah, as far as like good control decks go, Dinomorphia has remained fairly solid, even after getting its new piece of support, which is really only one trap card, right? So it's not like it was enough to give a lot of attention to the deck. So yeah, it's not even necessarily like new deck hype. It's definitely still just a pretty solid deck. Speaking of dinos that got support recently, just regular dinosaurs in general. This one I am going to put in Rogue, but I think this is still a very solid deck in its own right. This one I have noticed a little bit fewer of them as time has gone on, so I do think that quote-unquote new deck hype, the new recent support that I got a couple of seasons ago, of course, being the Ground Xeno and the big tuner dinosaur whose name I can never remember. Those two cards from like the Transcend Drake deck, right? The ones that care about like Ground Xeno, of course, also being the spell that cares about either, I think it's a vanilla, like a normal dinosaur monster, or a dinosaur tuner, which the other new piece of support is. So in any case, I've been seeing a little bit less of these, but I don't think it's necessarily because it is a deck that's getting weaker. I think it's still a very solid Rogue deck. And again, a deck being in Rogue does not mean I think it's bad. had any rogue deck that I list here, I think, again, is capable of reaching Master or Master 1 or sneaking a tournament top with enough dedication. I do think you would need a lot of dedication for this next deck we're going to talk about, which is Blue Eyes. Blue Eyes, I'm not going to lie, I'm just going to put it at the bottom of Rogue. I think that Blue Eyes has seen an increase in popularity because, I think it's pretty easy to guess, because of the latest structure deck. Now, a lot of the players who might have wanted to try Blue Eyes, which are quite a few of them, of course, Blue Eyes being one of the most iconic anime decks out there, you know, that deck became a lot more accessible very recently. So, been seeing a lot more Blue Eyes around. I don't know, I kind of hesitate to say that because I haven't personally. The data says there's been a lot more Blue Eyes around, but, and again, Untapped is where I'm pulling this all from. Untapped will also show you the rank distribution of a deck, as in it'll show you how often a deck is played in each rank. And if you look at Blue Eyes in particular, it sees like a good amount of play in Bronze through Plat, but then once you get to Diamond and Master, it sees like literally zero play, like at all. I don't know, not literally zero, but almost no play. So because I generally hang out in Diamond and Plat at any given season, I haven't seen Blue Eyes like literally once at all since the new structure deck has come out, but I know at lower ranks the deck has become much more popular. And again, even if I do put Blue Eyes at the bottom of Rogue, which, spoiler, I think this is probably going to be the lowest placed deck I put on this tier list this season, that does not mean I think it is a bad deck. It is not a bad deck at all. Although it is very rare to see Blue Eyes in Master, that doesn't mean that you can't get there. Not by any means. I think especially with a deck that has as much support as Blue Eyes, like, yeah, I think it's reasonable to. Again, you would need to know the deck well and play it a lot to get there, but I think you could do it, definitely. Okay, Mikanko. I am going to put Mikanko in, like, upper tier 3, but ever since the Infernoble, which, funnily enough, is the next deck we're going to talk about, ever since Infernobles came out, that was a huge boost to the Mikanko deck, particularly the variants that like to play 60 cards and do a lot of, like, comboing, and sometimes even want to go first, right? There are Mikanko variants out there that don't always necessarily want to go second. Of course, Mikanko is very well known for going second. A lot of the times that is just what they do, to the point where if you are on ladder and you lose the coin flip but your opponent lets you go first, there's a very, very, very good chance, much better than not, that they are on Mikanko. Could be on something like Numeron or Cyber Dragon as well, but you don't see those decks quite as often as you do at Mikanko. And again, ever since Infernoble stuff came out, I'm a little tempted to put this in tier 2. Like, I think Mikanko is a very, very good deck. It's one that I think I've also underrated in the past. I don't know, Mikanko's one of those decks where, like, I could see it being in Rogue, and I understand why I put it in Rogue in the previous tier list, but, like, I don't know, it's like, maybe this just has always been a tier 3 deck this whole time. Tier 3 deck always has been. The fucking meme with the astronauts, anyway. Speaking of Infernoble, this is one of the new... Well, it's not really a new deck. Infernoble did exist before the latest wave of support, but it gained a lot more relevance with the latest wave of support. That said, I think I'm going to end up putting Infernoble in tier 3, just a little bit above where Mikanko is at. I do think that Infernoble is a very, very powerful deck, and I honestly shudder at the thought of what a truly dedicated and skilled Infernoble pilot could do with the combo lines in that deck. To me, it just seems like one of those, like, big brain decks that, you know, you would need to know very, very well to use it to its full potential. And in that regard, I would expect Infernoble to be, I talked this a little bit in yesterday's video, I expect Infernoble to be one of those decks that we will gradually see the number of people playing it go down over time, but you'll see its win rate gradually go up over time. And I think that has a direct correlation. I think that the people who stick with Infernoble and use it a lot are truly, you know, the true dedicated pilots are going to bring up the overall skill of the deck as far as it's represented on ladder, because they get better with it and can use it to its full potential. So Infernobles, like, I think tier 3 is a pretty good spot for it. You could make an argument that it's at the bottom of tier 2, and I wouldn't fault you for that. But when I think about the other decks that are in tier 2, I kind of don't think Infernoble... It's not that Infernoble lacks the power. I think that, you know, having such long combo lines, Infernoble is pretty subject to not only player error, but also just regular old disruption as well. And it's also one of those combo decks where, like, you can memorize the lines and know them down pat, but sometimes if you get disrupted, it can be a little bit tricky, even with practice, to know exactly where to play from there, like what to do from there, right? So, yeah, I think that tier 3 is a good spot for Infernobles. All right, let's talk about Kashtira next. Kashtira, I've been putting in tier 3 in the last couple of seasons, but I'm going to bump it up to tier 2 for this season. Kashtira has kind of floored me with how good it's been. Not only that I've been observing in win rate trends on ranked ladder, tournament tops in, well, tournaments, of course, but also in my own playing Kashtira in this meta. It's wild how good this deck is right now. It's got a lot of really good things going for it. You know, this is a meta where you need a lot of different diverse responses when it comes to your disruption, like hand traps and stuff, and Kashtira can afford to play a lot of different kinds of disruption, not just in terms of hand traps, but also in terms of board breakers. But speaking of disruption cards, Kashtira can play probably the best one in this format, which is Dimension Shifter. I think indeed any deck that can play Dimension Shifter or that generally hates on the graveyard is definitely noticeably good in this particular meta. Of course, there is Snake Eyes being a lot of the reason for that, but in general, a lot of decks in this format really care about their stuff going to the graveyard. So if you have them under a banish lock, or just, you know, have them under banishing in general, that can put a huge damper in their strategy. It's for those reasons, and also for the fact that it is just a very solid deck, that Kashtira, again, I think last time I put it on a tier list, I had it in tier 3, maybe even the last couple of times, but I'm going to bump it up to tier 2, and that's even with Fenrir and Birth being at 1, which is kind of wild. The deck is still performing as well as it is here. So, yeah, no, I think tier 2 is a good spot for it. Okay. Adventure Phantom Knight. I think this is another very solid tier 3 deck. I'm going to put it just a little bit above Dinomorphia and a little bit below Makonko. But I think it's pretty comparable to Dinomorphia in terms of its overall power level in the current meta. Phantom Knights are also getting a second copy of Water Enchantress, which is pretty cool. Granted, it doesn't super need it because you can send Water Enchantress to the graveyard as part of your combo line anyway. But one thing that I do think is cool about having a second Water Enchantress is that now you have the option to open it more, which means that you have more variety in which you can do in your combo lines, because the Cherubini doesn't need to send the Water Enchantress. You could send something else that you need, like if you need a Torn Scale or an Ancient Cloak or a, you know, Silent Boots, or if you don't know what you need, or if you need one of the trap cards, you can also just send a Ragged Gloves too. And even though, again, the deck only technically needs one Water Enchantress, I think that a second one will still be a nice bit of boost in its power level. Phantom Knights is a really cool deck, and it's really cool ever since Terra Top went to 3 to see it not only get the attention I think it deserves, but then in turn perform at about as well I think as the deck should be. Which, if you think about it, Speedway Terra Top from 1 to 3, like, yeah, that is a pretty nice boost, but like, I don't know. I'll die on this hill. I think Phantom Knights have always been good this whole time. I think Phantom Knights this whole time have been, like, well, except maybe for when Shufflers were big, right? The Ishizu Shufflers. Except for maybe at that time, I think Phantom Knights have always been rogue, bordering on tier 3. But now, with Terra Top at 3, and also even a further boost to the second Water Enchantress coming soon, I think they will firmly remain a very good tier 3 deck. Alright, Traptrix Sarah. If I think that Dinomorphia is on the tier 3 side of the borderline between tier 3 and Rogue, I'm going to put Traptrix right at the top on the other end. Traptrix, much like Dinomorphia, is kind of one of those decks that, like, I guess Dinomorphia, of course, to get new support. I was going to say that doesn't get new support, but even though Traptrix hasn't had new support in a little while, the deck is still very solid. I think a lot of the reason it doesn't see more play is that there are a couple of notably, well, there's really one notably better trap deck. That's going to be Labyrinth, with Dinomorphia being, I guess I just said, about the same power level. So I think if there weren't other better back row decks in the format, you would be seeing a lot more Traptrix. Very solid deck. I am Definitely going to keep it up here at the top of Rogue. Just behind it, I'm going to put Sky Strikers. Not a deck that I personally tend to see a whole lot, but definitely one that still can put up some very good results. I think one of the biggest things that Sky Strikers has going for it is that you can play it in... It has like a couple of different modes, and not just like ways to build the deck, although that is true as well. But even within the same build, you know, Sky Strikers can be either very controlling, or in the right circumstance, it can even perform a surprise OTK kind of out of nowhere, which is pretty cool. I think it's really cool that the deck can shift gears like that. And also, you know, it plays the way that I like a lot of control decks to play, which is that, of course, it's just how control decks play in general, which is like gaining incremental advantage over time. I think the way that Sky Striker goes about doing that is very neat. It's a very, very cool deck. Definitely a very solid contender. Spiral is one of those decks that I'm going to put in Rogue as well, though I'll put it more mid-Rogue as opposed to upper Rogue. It's funnily enough one of those decks. So if you look again at Untapped, which again is what I'm basing the deck selection off of here, if you look at Untapped, the meta tier list and the win rate in correlation to the rank distribution, you will notice that decks that tend to have a lower win rate tend to be mostly played at lower ranks. But there are a few interesting exceptions, and Spiral actually happens to be one of them. Spiral doesn't boast a particularly high win rate, but if you look at the rank distribution, it sees by far the most amount of play in Master Rank. So which I think is really interesting, that you'll see these kind of like data anomalies. Although to be fair, if you think about it less from a numerical data standpoint, just look at the deck itself, it makes a little bit of sense, right? Spiral is one of those decks that is very, very complicated to play. That makes sense why you not only see it at a higher rank, but also why it tends to have a lower win rate. But you know, it's kind of like it for Nobles, where it's one of those decks where people who are really dedicated to it can do some wild things with it, and the combo lines there. And again, it's a deck that hasn't received new support in a while either. It's just been a solid deck. Again, this is a solid deck, always has been, Astronaut Meme. Yeah, so next up, we're going to talk about Sword Soul. Sword Soul, Sword Soul, Sword Soul. You've probably seen this deck, if not historically, then recently with, of course, the new player campaign giving just about everyone access to a Sword Soul deck now, which I think is really cool. I think Sword Soul is a good deck for beginners to the competitive Yu-Gi-Oh scene. It's not only a very solid deck in its own right, it's got easy to learn combo lines, but still a good skill ceiling that overall just makes it a very, very solid contender. In fact, I think a lot of people are even sick of seeing Sword Soul because of how common it is, especially now that it's been given to a lot of us as a structure deck. I think Sword Soul is kind of the epitome of a very, very good Tier 3 deck. In fact, might end up being the top of Tier 3. Well, no, you know what? Actually, I'm looking at the next deck on here, Tier Limits. I am going to put it in Tier 3 above Sword Soul. While Tier Limits are not as commonly seen as Sword Soul, I think they are notably more powerful. And I would not sleep on King of the Swamp going from 1 to 3. I do think that will be a notable boost to Tier Limit. I don't think it's going to shoot up to Tier 1, but I do see a world where next season we see Tier Limit in Tier 2. You could make an argument, honestly, as again, I always talk about with these decks that are right on the border between two tiers. If someone wanted to make an argument that Tier Limit is currently a Tier 2 deck, I don't even necessarily think they would be wrong to do so, but I think I'll keep it at the top of Tier 3 for the time being. Revolution Synchron was a recent release that boosted Tier Limit, but I think that the King of the Swamp Unlimit will be a much more noticeable boost for the deck's power there. So, alright, next up we have Manadium, who I ironically represent with Prime Heart, even though this is like the one card that actually doesn't see play in Manadiums, but Manadium in the last tier list, I think I had it at the bottom of Tier 1, but even though the deck got Crimson Dragon and did get boosted by the release of it in that way, I think it actually slid down to the point where I'm going to put Manadium in Tier 2, and I think I might even put it lower than Kashira, honestly. Like, I think in this particular meta, Kashira is probably just the better deck, which is wild, how much, you know, the release of Snake Eye has kind of pivoted other decks' position in the meta, particularly, again, decks that are fairly well poised against Snake Eye and other graveyard-based decks. But Monadium, I would expect to see this deck see an increase in power level at some point, because believe it or not, we still, at this point in time, do not have full power Monadium. That probably seems wild. It's like, wait, the deck got new support like a couple of sets ago, and then it got the Crimson Dragon as well. It's still not, no, it's still not at full power. We still need the level 4 Visas Samsara, I think it's called. The level 4 version of Visas Starfrost, which will be a pretty noticeable boost to the deck's power level when that comes out. For the time being, though, I think it's a very, very good tier 2 deck, but I do think Hashira might be slightly better right now. Speaking of graveyard hate strategies that got a noticeable boost in this meta, Exosister, if you look at the win rate for Exosister, it's kind of wild how much it's shot up ever since Snake Eye came out. And actually, I think I'm going to put Exosister in the bottom of tier 3 here. Because Exos I normally have is a pretty firmly rogue deck, but I do think that due to the circumstances of this meta in particular, Exos have actually gotten enough of a power boost, not from their own stuff getting support, but from either how well they play against everything else, that I'm willing to call them tier 3 and put them at the bottom of tier 3. Yeah, I'll put them there, definitely. Stun! Despite all those Floodgate hits a couple of seasons ago, we are still seeing quite a few stun variants around, but they are more reliant now on having to draw into the one-ofs of their powerful Floodgates, but more than that, they're also having to rely on a lot of weaker Floodgates, like more copies of, like, Dimensional Fissure and Macrocosmos and Grave of the Super Ancient Organism, like that kind of a thing, which is honestly good news for all of us, because those kinds of floodgates are easier to play through. Even Snake Eye, you know, like, as much as I'm talking about how important it is for Snake Eye to access the graveyard, which it is, like, I've still had games playing Snake Eye where I play against Stun that on their turn 1 plays a Dimensional Fissure, and I can still win the duel. Like, it's not that, it's like, you know, it's more difficult to play through, of course, but it's definitely not as bad as them being on, like, 3 Skill Drain, and 3 Rivalry, and 3 Gozen, and 3 there can be only one, you know, like that kind of a thing. So, Stun, I think, is a pretty firmly rogue deck. I'm going to put it here just a little bit above Blue Eyes. I do actually think that Stun is a better deck than Blue Eyes. But again, that doesn't mean that Blue Eyes is a horrible deck or anything. But yeah, I already went through that at the beginning. Anyway, Super Heavy Samurai has seen a noticeable drop in play rate. From my own personal experience, and this is in, you know, upper ranks, Diamond and Master, I can count the number of time I played against Super Heavy Samurai this season, like, literally on one hand. Like, it's been that few. But also I know that my own personal anecdote does not necessarily define like how good a deck is, right? I do think Super Heavy Samurai could still be considered tier 1, but I'm probably going to end up putting it on the bottom of tier 1. There are at least a couple of other decks that I think will end up going above it in tier 1. And I think one of the reasons that we're seeing Super Heavy Samurai drop off is, well, a couple of main reasons. One, most people who are on Super Heavy Samurai are now on Snake Eye. And 2, just people bringing dedicated answers to Super Heavy Samurai. I mean, we're in a format where Droll is arguably, like, not that great anymore, and people are still kind of bringing it en masse on the off chance you play against Super Heavy Samurai or, like, you know, maybe Monadium. So, I mean, it's come to a point where I'm starting to question whether or not I still want Droll in some of the decks that I have them in, just because, you know, I don't think Super Heavy Samurai is a common matchup at all. Although there are other reasons to play Droll besides just this one deck, right? Namely, a lot of reason I play Droll in some of the decks that I do is because those kinds of decks I have Droll in can play through it, and therefore you can use Droll against an opponent's Max C and still play your own strategy, right? So... But yeah, Super Heavy Samurai, I'll still call it a tier 1 deck. I was a little tempted to put this in tier 2 though, I'm not gonna lie. But I think a lot of the reason for that is because, again, I personally just don't see it anymore. But again, I know I can't use my own personal anecdotes as the only, you know, kind of evidence for where a deck should be on the tier list. So I'm gonna put it in tier 1, but I think it will probably end up being the bottom of tier 1. Or again, I at least know 2 other decks I'm gonna put above it here. Okay, next up is going to be Live Twin Sprite. I do think that this is, well, we've definitely seen it be the most represented Sprite variant. It's probably still just the best one. I kind of still think Adventure Sprite is better, and with Water Enchantress coming to 2, I'm definitely looking forward to testing Adventure Sprite a lot more. But Twin Sprite is still a phenomenally good deck. I'm going to put Twin Sprite in Upper Rogue here. It pains me to not have a Sprite deck be at least tier 3, but if I'm being honest with myself, and again, not letting my own personal biases affect where I put stuff on the tier list, I do think that Twin Sprite, the most represented and probably most powerful Sprite variant, is probably just going to be in Upper Rogue right now. Okay, you know what? I actually lied earlier when I said that Super Heavy Samurai was going to be the bottom tier 1 deck. I think I'm actually going to put Vanquish Soul in tier 1, but as the bottom tier 1 deck. I was going to put this as the top tier 2 deck, but the more I think about it, and especially the more I think about where Vanquish Soul has been on Untapped's tier list this whole time, in terms of win rate, this whole season, literally the entire season, it's been the deck across all ranks with the highest win rate. And it makes sense. The deck is, one, good. It's just a really, really good deck. But beyond that, it can also make use of Dimension Shifter, which is very, very good in this meta. It also plays very well under Max C, which is, you know, obviously a factor in the meta at any given point. It's not necessarily stopped by Droll. It's hurt by Droll, but mainly what I'm getting at here is that Vanquish Soul plays through and or around every single popular hand trap right now. It also plays well through and around board breakers. On top of that, it can, like I said, make use of Dimension Shifter, which is very, very good in this meta. And on top of that, again, it's just a really good deck. So I think that it's not wild to call Vanquish Soul a tier 1 deck, because, and again, if you look at Untapped, it's just across all rank, across the whole season, it's just had the highest win rate the entire time. By that token, you could even make an argument that it is actually just the top tier 1 deck, but I don't think you can base a tier list solely on win rate, especially for a game like Yu-Gi-Oh!, which has noticeably different best of 1 and best of 3, you know, format differences, right? So, but I'm definitely still, but you also still, you do still see Vanquish Soul in a lot of tournament tops as well. So I'm more than willing to call it a tier 1 deck. I'll put it as the actual bottom of tier 1 here as opposed to Super Heavy Samurai. Salamangreat. Salamangreat has seen a recent resurgence in popularity. I imagine mostly thanks to the Sinful Spoils engine and Diabellstar and all that fun stuff. But Salamangreat does also have some really good support coming out in the near future here. It hasn't been leaked yet, as far as I know, but just going by release schedules, right, of TCG and OCG, I would expect to see the new Salamangreat stuff here in the relatively near future. But even before that, I still think it's a very, very good deck in its own right. I'm going to put it in Rogue. I'll put it down here. I think it's pretty comparable to stuff like Spiral and Dino in terms of its power level being mid-Rogue here. So Branded Despia, as represented by Alibur, I think is one of the tier 1 decks I am willing to put above Super Heavy Samurai. Branded Despia is a very, very good deck. Not that you need me to tell you that, I'm sure you've come across the deck. And I also don't think the deck needs too many hits. I think a good quality of life hit for just the meta in general, but especially tournament metas, would be to, as you know, as I've said before, even in yesterday's video, ban Albion Sanctifier. You know, again, I just think on principle that card should be banned. And every time I bring this up, there's always that comment that's like, just ban the lock cards. And it's like, I actually tweeted about this recently too. The argument I always see for keeping Sanctifier is that you can't ban Sanctifier. It's an important tool for Branded. Just ban all those lock cards instead. And it's like, well, okay, but those lock cards are also important tools for the decks. You and just about literally every Yu-Gi-Oh player might not care about Gimmick Puppet as a deck, but Nightmare is still a decent card in that deck. Moreover, and this is the point I've always made, is that if you just ban Gimmick Puppet Nightmare, the next lingering lock card is DD Orthos. And if you ban that, now we're hitting a rogue deck. Like, DDD needs Orthos for its main combo lines. And now we're hitting multiple rogue decks and taking away their meta viability just so you can keep Albion Sanctifier. It's like, the tweet that I made was like kind of calling some, not everyone of course, but some people who defend Sanctifier hypocrites, because they'll go on about how you can't ban Sanctifier, it's an important tool for Brandon. It's like, okay, but the lock cards are important tools for all of these casual or lower rogue decks, which are obviously way less powerful. And the response is always like, not always, but the response a lot of the time is like, yeah, but who cares about those decks? And it's like, okay, well, now you're just being a hypocrite. If you're going to sit here and say that Sanctifier is an important tool for Branded, so it shouldn't be banned, but also advocate the banning of every lock card, that is a hypocritical stance. Because, again, those lock cards are important for those casual or lower rogue decks, which, funnily enough, the Yu-Gi-Oh community will always try to champion and advocate for until it means their favorite deck is going to take a hit. Then it's like, oh no, okay, we'll forget those decks then, because, you know, again, it's just so blatant, like, favoritism towards Branded, which, you know, whatever. It's like, I would have a lot more respect for that stance if people would just admit that. If they were like, well, I like Branded more, so I wanted to keep its tools and ban the other tools. And it's like, I don't agree with it at that point. I think you're still wrong, but, you know, at least then you would have the gall to openly say that. But anyway, as far as, like, Branded in, like, best of one ranked ladder, which, to be fair, Puppet Locks and Albion Sanctifier don't really affect. I just think, again, it would be an overall nice quality of life thing. Well, that's the thing, too, right? Is that, again, I've seen the comment section make arguments in the past when I've said, particularly when I talked about Runic Fountain, and I said, well, the card's not that powerful. The deck's not that powerful. It doesn't need to get hit. And people were like, well, but just because the deck or card isn't powerful doesn't mean if it creates unfun game states that it shouldn't be hit. Which, one, Runic Fountain didn't create the unfun game states. Those were Floodgate cards that people were complaining about. Two, I just find it funny how the comment section will suddenly ignore this ideal when it comes to Albion Sanctifier, right? Because another point that a lot of people will make is that, well, Sanctifier Puppet Locks doesn't even happen on ladder that much. And it's like, well, okay, but still for a nice quality of life thing, and to avoid non-games, let's just get rid of Sanctifier. Also, another funny reply that I saw, because, like, again, I see people say, like, oh, Sanctifier is such an important tool for Brandon. And it's like, for what? Like, because I gotta be honest with you, I've not seen Sanctifier do anything on ranked ladder. I've personally witnessed it do Puppet Locks, you know, very occasionally on ladder and more often in tournaments, but on ladder, maybe one time I've had an opponent summon Sanctifier, and it's like, I don't know, I can't imagine it being that important of a tool. But I'm also not a Branded player, so, you know, who knows. Anyway, my main point here is that I don't think, even though despite it being one of the best decks of the format, Branded needs a lot of, like, consistency hits to its main strategy. We just had an opening go from 2 to 1, which is, like, whatever. It's like, it's such a non-hit, but, I don't know. That's just my 2 cents about Branded right now. All in all, there. But let's talk about Labyrinth. Labyrinth is another very solid tier 2 deck. I'm a little tempted to actually put it above Monadium, because I feel like Labyrinth tends to perform in this meta a little bit better than Monadium. Kind of interesting how my opinion on Monadium, I didn't even realize until I am putting all these decks on a tier list how much my opinion of Monadium's power level is kind of like gradually slipping down. But again, I don't think Monadium is a bad deck by any means. It will definitely get better over time as well. But Labyrinth, I think I'll leave at the bottom of tier 2. It's just kind of been one of those mainstays of the meta. Much like Branded, like, even though it's been around at this power level for quite a while, I think it's fine where it is. I don't think it necessarily needs to be hit. Yeah, I think Lab's totally fine right now. All right, Rescue Ace. This deck saw a recent boost with the Snake Eye and Diabell Star stuff coming out. Snake Eye Rescue Ace being kind of the main way to play the deck in Master Duel. It's interesting to have the Sinful Spoil stuff and not the follow-up Rescue Ace support, because it's kind of created this unique state for the deck build where you want to be playing a lot of, like, you want the Snake Eye and Original Sin and all that stuff to help boost consistency, and yet at the same time, it's still good to be above 40 because you don't want to draw a lot of your Rescue Ace spell and trap cards, and indeed, accessing a lot of your Rescue Ace engine can be a little bit awkward for that reason sometimes. So, like, I don't know, it's in a really weird state, Rescue Ace, but not a bad one by any means. I think that right now Rescue Ace is probably on the lower end of the tier 3 spectrum. Once it gets its follow-up support, that'll probably get boosted up to tier 2, if not 1, probably 1. Well, it'll depend if we get, in what order we get the stuff, right? Like, if we get Fire Kings at the same time as the new Rescue Ace stuff, then Rescue Ace will probably be tier 2. But if we get the new Rescue Ace stuff first, then we'll probably see Rescue Ace at tier 1. Who knows? We'll have to see what order things ultimately end up coming out here. Next up, we're going to talk about Ninja. Been a pretty popular rogue mainstay for quite some time due to its structure deck. Also, coincidentally, my least favorite deck to play against. I think flipping stuff down permanently is dumb and unfun. But that's just, I don't think it's, like, objectively bad. I just personally don't like it. I'll put Ninja, like right here. Like, somewhere in the neighborhood of upper to mid rogue. Which, again, you might hear me say mid and rogue and be like, oh, so that means it's bad! No, it doesn't. But anyway, yeah, I think that's a good spot for Ninja. For Punk. Punk is, God, this is another one of those decks that, like, I could really see myself putting it in tier 3 or rogue. I think I'm going to put it in upper rogue. It's kind of fallen off a little bit. Like, when Gold Pride first came out, a lot of people were super up on Punks. And I think both Gold Pride and Punk are still very good decks, don't get me wrong. But I just noticed that the popularity has kind of shifted away from them. And also in terms of power level, I will say it's like, the Punk engine and the Punk combo line is really cool and fun and good. It is good, don't get me wrong. But over time, I do notice it being, like, very, very slightly power creeped, just by things that other decks are doing. Mathmech. I'm actually going to put this as the top tier 2 deck, I think. Mathmech, I think, is really, really close to being at tier 1, especially with Circular still being at 3 for some reason. Oh my god, I can't believe that. I was floored when I saw Parallel Exceed get semi-limited. It was, rather surprising. I really thought Circular was going to get limited on this tier list, or this last ban list, rather, but it wasn't. I think for that reason, Mathmech remains the best tier 2 deck of the meta right now. I think just very barely not making the tier 1 cut, just due to the power level of what other decks can do at the current moment. Hero has also received a nice power boost recently, in the form of the Infernal Rage Flame Wingman. I'm actually, yet again, a little tempted to put this at tier 3, but I will... I think I will actually put Hero at the top of Rogue this time. Yeah, I think I will, because this one's really, really close for me. And Hero has been one of those upper to mid Rogue decks for a long while now, but again, the noticeable, I do see a noticeable power boost in the latest support card that I got, and also seeing a noticeable spike in popularity as a result too. Naturia Runic is kind of the opposite, where it is not a very popular deck and doesn't really have much going for it right now in the way of new support cards, but despite that, has remained an upper rogue deck. I'm going to put it right up here alongside Punk and Twin Sprite. Maybe even a little bit above, honestly. Maybe even a little bit above Trap Tricks, because if you look at win rates, this is another one of those decks where, like, it doesn't get played a lot, but its win rate always puts it up there with a lot of the other meta decks you would expect to see. Just a very, very cool and a good deck. Alright, time to finally talk about the Snake Eyes in the room. When Snake Eyes were first, when they first came out onto Master Duel, and we got Poplar as a surprise too, I made the prediction that Snake Eye was going to be a very, very solid tier 2 deck. I was wrong. Poplar was actually enough to just push Snake Eye into not only tier 1, but also being, I think, pretty undisputedly the top tier 1 deck of the meta right now. But it's also, I think it's a lot like Tearlament in that while it is currently the most dominant deck, a lot of people who regularly play competitively don't really have an issue with this. Snake Eye is a fun deck to play, it's a cool deck to play, and it's interesting to play both with and also against as well, because a lot of, like, Snake Eye isn't like Super Heavy Samurai where it just, front loads all of its stuff onto its end board and just kind of like, does an arm gesture to your opponent and say, all right, deal with this now. Snake Eye interacts and makes plays during your opponent's turn. What cards they might go into, what their end board might look like can change depending on what the opponent does. And there's also a ton of different ways to play Snake Eye too, not just in terms of variants like TG and Rescue Ace like we talked about earlier, and all those, but on top of that, just pure Snake Eye, there are so many different ways to build it. You can play Where Art Thou, you could play Small World, you could play Birch, you could not play those cards, you could play Magician Souls, you could play, like, there's so many different things that you can be doing with Snake Eyes that I don't at all have a problem with this being, like, as good as it is. Just because it's not tier 0. It's not completely and utterly dominating the format, even though it is very prevalent in the format. It does not feel like it is oppressive. And again, the matches both with and against it, I think, are interesting. So, yeah, definitely the top deck of this meta, and I'm not sad about that, honestly. Alright, Blackwing, I think much like Ninja, and I think I'm probably going to put it in about the same spot, maybe a little bit lower, honestly, maybe closer to Salamangreats. It's kind of one of those mainstay rogue decks because it's got a structure deck, and Blackwing has also always been a fan favorite. I picked up Blackwing fairly recently because I finally pulled the level 6 Synchro UR, No Thung the Starlight, and yeah, it's a fun deck. I can definitely see why people like it. It's a pretty firm mid-rogue deck. I think mid, like the lower end of middle rogue, I think is a good spot for it. Okay, finally, we're going to talk about Fluandereeze. Is going to be the last deck on this tier list. I'm going to put this in mid-rogue, although I'm a little tempted to slide it up a little bit. Just a little bit. Flunder does have the Graveyard Hate thing going for it. Being able to play Shifter, any deck that can right now, I think is notable and stands out for that reason. And yeah, Fluandereeze is definitely no exception to that. I don't know, I'm kind of thinking about it. It's like, I am actually going to bump it up, I think, a little bit more within the Rogue tier. Just because, like, yeah, it's a very, very good deck. It's good against the meta in particular. And also, like, come on, Konami. Like, I may not like Fluandereeze. It's not one of my favorite decks to play against, but, like, even I can admit, like, just give him a couple M-Pens back. Like, come on, the deck is not that good that it need to get hit as severely as it is. But, alright. I'm just looking over this list here one last time, seeing if I want to shuffle anything around. I don't think I do. I think that I am pretty satisfied with where these decks ended up on this tier list. So, yeah, again, whether you agree or disagree, definitely feel free to let me know in the comments. Just, again, don't be mean about it. Don't be a jerk. That's all I ask. Pretty simple request. I don't think it's one that's too much to ask, but it is of some people. But anyway, not of most of you. Not of the vast majority of you. The vast majority of you are, you get it. You get it. You know what's up. But yeah, I think that is going to just about do it for this tier list video. So thanks for watching. Let's go ahead and move now to our outro. Hey everybody, thank you so much for watching all the way to the end of the video. That means a lot to me. It's also a great way to support the channel, so thank you very much in that way as well. If you're interested in supporting the channel in other ways, like the very special patrons that I am thanking here, you can do so by checking out some of the links in the description. One of those goes to the Patreon, where you can join these fine folk and support the channel that way. I do post daily content over on Patreon, so you do get something for supporting supporting there. And if you're interested, I also have a coaching tier option as well. Details, again, will be on Patreon in the link below. Also in the description, linked below, is my Twitch page where I stream a few times a week. You can go ahead and check that out, follow or subscribe over there if you ever want to catch me live. You'll also find my second YouTube channel if you feel like subscribing over there to watch some of the Twitch VODs as well as some additional non-Yu-Gi-Oh related content that I make over there. Again, any of those links you want to check out is all a great way of supporting. But again, even if you don't do that, just watching was also a fantastic way to support. And once again, I have to thank you so very much. But in any case, this is Hexlex. I'm going to be signing out, and I'm hoping you have a fantastic day.